Okay, before we get into the details, the nitty-gritty, and the engineering of the old vintage motocross bikes, I just want to give a shout out to all the fine fellas still racing. Before 1976, all the dirt bikes, probably the street bikes too, were piston port intakes or rotary valve. Most of them were piston port. This is my first dirt bike. This is my second dirt bike. They ran great. I didn't ever think, oh, well, I don't have the modern reed valve on it. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't care. They ran great. I never got to the point where I outgrew them. So yeah, this is kind of a step back in time to try to understand how the piston port works, which you need an understanding of something before you want to modify it. So although this video is about piston port intakes, I want to mention how the reed valve engine functions. The crank, as it's rotating, it can be depicted here, and the different colors depict the different actions that are going along in relation to the movement of the crank. And so you see the port that's open the most is the exhaust port. And we've got the intake happening from when the transfer closes to top dead center. So as the piston is rising, and you reach this point right here where the piston closes the transfers, from that time, starting at that time, is when the area is being forced under the piston to be larger, and so it's going to cause a suction of the air-fuel mixture in from the reed valve, and that will happen all the way until that reaches top dead center. But with a piston port engine, it's not that way. When you're at that same point where the rising piston's closing off the transfer port, it only causes a suction, a vacuum here. There's no intake going on because the piston's closing off that port. So it's rising, it's causing more and more vacuum, and then boom. And so you have a wall of negative pressure going towards the carburetor, which is why the jets on a carburetor of a piston port engine have to be smaller to compensate for that. So we see that here, the end of the transfers, nothing happens except for the increase in vacuum. And then the intake starts to flow once that port becomes opened. And so then you go up, and at high RPM, you go up and you go back down, there's still some intake going on because it goes beyond that due to inertia effects. So it depends upon the RPM, of course. And the idea being that this duration is going to be set in harmony with that top RPM, so that the end of the flow does happen right around here. So it'll be like the end of the flow, and then it'll start to kick back a little bit, or maybe not at all. I'm not exactly sure on that, but it's around here. So that's a pretty big difference between the reed valve and the piston port engine. And so what happens as you increase this intake duration, you're decreasing the amount of vacuum that is allowed to build up in the crankcase before that port opens, which is not that big a deal. And then when the intake port closes, from that time until the opening of the transfers, you're creating pressure. Here we were creating negative pressure, here we're creating positive pressure that's going to influence the flow through the transfers. Let me show you. So we've gone to top dead center, we're going down, okay, everything's stopped, we've got basically zero pressure in the crankcase, and now it's starting to become pressurized. Yeah, getting some pressure going there, and then the transfers open, and that speed of flow is relative to the pressure in the crankcase. So the idea being that generally we all agree that more duration is required with higher RPM. Okay, but see what happens when you increase that duration, change that point from there to over here, you're allowing less distance of the piston to pressurize that. Okay, so you increase the duration because you're planning on making the engine rev higher, but you just now reduce the pressure that's going to affect the transfer. Okay, which has the opposite effect. So there's a balance point that's going on, and I'm trying to figure out how to calculate that. This right here is my porting calculator, and this section right here is new. This section right here is for calculating the crankcase compression ratio. This is for an estimate of what duration is going to be needed to achieve a higher RPM. So this data is for my 48cc engine, and with an intake duration of 108, it was revving up to 5500, and then I increased it to 137, and I was able to go to 6500. So I set the formula in there to correspond to that increase. Of course, it's going to be a little bit this way, a little bit that way with different engines, but you know, having a starting point is good. Okay, I'm going to go into the details in a different video, and I just wanted to say that there are two graphs. The effect of the intake time. Okay, you have more intake time, you're able to have more RPM, so that's why it's increasing. But as you increase the intake duration, because you're decreasing this distance right here, you're allowing it to make less pressure, and so it's a lower crankcase compression ratio. So that causes a decrease in the top RPM according to that crankcase compression ratio. And even though this graph is not extending over here to show where the two lines cross, it is able to take that data and figure it out. And it's saying out here that they're going to cross at 7,000. And the crankcase compression ratio that will be needed is 1.08, and the intake duration that's needed is 151. So that's my next step, is to change that intake duration to 151 to see if I'm able to achieve that 7,000 RPM. So I'm going to do that tomorrow, God willing. So stay tuned. Well, I just got back in from a test run, and after sizing the main jet correctly, I was able to get it to go 6,900. So the calculations here are pretty close. And my closing comments here are, if you have any interesting stories about how you improved the output, either the power or the RPM of your piston port intake engine, I would like to hear about it in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching and have a great day.